On December 5, 1782, in the quiet Dutch village of Kinderhook, New York, a child was born into a newly emerging America, Martin Van Buren, the first U.S. president to be born after the American Revolution. The son of Abraham Van Buren, a tavern keeper and farmer, and Maria Hose Van Buren, Martin was raised in a modest yet lively household infused with revolutionary fervor and strong Dutch traditions. The Van Buren family were Dutch Americans through and through. Martin's first language was not English, but Dutch, making him the only American president to this day whose first language was not English. The Kinderhook community still clung to its Dutch customs, and Martin's upbringing reflected that blend of Old World heritage and New World promise. His father's tavern served as more than just a local watering hole. It was a hub of political activity. Traveling politicians and thinkers often passed through Kinderhook and stopped by the Van Buren Tavern. Martin, a quiet but observant boy, soaked in the fiery debates and animated discussions between farmers, soldiers, and politicians. These early encounters were the beginning of his political education. Though the Van Burens were not wealthy, they were respected, and Martin's early education was relatively solid. He attended local village schools and was praised for his intellect and quick grasp of language. But unlike many elite politicians who would follow, Van Buren did not go to college. Instead, he took the traditional path of many aspiring young lawyers of the era. He read law under a mentor. By the age of 14, he began studying law in the office of Francis Sylvester, a prominent Federalist attorney. Martin, a committed Democratic Republican from an early age, found ideological conflict in Sylvester's office, but the apprenticeship strengthened his legal mind and taught him discipline, strategy, and argumentation. He then studied under his half-brother James Van Allen, and later in New York City. The young Martin Van Buren was short in stature, with fiery red hair and sharp eyes. While he lacked the military bravado or aristocratic air of his contemporaries, he possessed something far more potent: political instinct, charm, and an uncanny ability to organize and persuade. These qualities would soon propel him into a career that would redefine American politics. The making of a lawyer and family man, 1796 to 1819. By 1803, Martin Van Buren was admitted to the New York bar, officially beginning his career as a practicing attorney. At just 21 years old, he returned to Kinderhook and opened a law office with his half-brother. He quickly earned a reputation as a skilled litigator, sharp-tongued, composed, and unafraid to challenge established names in court. But Van Buren's mind was never far from politics. He believed the courtroom was a platform for training a politician's skills: persuasion, logic, and influence. As he practiced law, he also began building a political network that would become the foundation of his career. In 1807, he married his childhood sweetheart and cousin, Hannah Hose, in what would be a tender and deeply personal union. They were both of Dutch heritage, and their household reflected the simplicity and warmth of their upbringing. The couple had 4 sons, and Van Buren was described as a devoted husband and father. But happiness was not to last. In 1819, tragedy struck when Hannah fell ill and died of tuberculosis.
Van Buren was heartbroken.
Though just 37 at the time of her death, he never remarried, a decision that spoke to the depth of his love and loyalty. Friends noted that he wore black mourning clothes for years and kept her memory close. Professionally, however, Van Buren's star continued to rise. In 1812, he was elected to the New York State Senate, marking his formal entrance into public life. He quickly aligned himself with the Democratic Republicans and became a fierce opponent of the Federalist Party. He also served as Attorney General of New York from 1815 to 1819, all while maintaining an active role in party organization. Van Buren was not a fiery speaker like some of his contemporaries, but he was strategic, soft-spoken, and always thinking several moves ahead. He was rapidly earning a nickname that would follow him for life: the Little Magician. It wasn't just because of his short height and elegant appearance. It was for his political sorcery, his ability to turn situations in his favor quietly and effectively. As the 1810s drew to a close, Martin Van Buren had built a reputation in New York as not just a capable leader, but a master tactician. What lay ahead was a transformation from state politician to national figure. a journey that would reshape American politics from the ground up. The Albany Regency and the rise of a political machine, 1819 to 1829. The next phase of Van Buren's life would see him at the center of one of the most powerful political machines in U.S. history, the Albany Regency. This tightly organized group of lawyers, journalists, and loyal supporters operated behind the scenes to control New York politics, and Martin Van Buren was its mastermind. He believed that democracy worked best when it was structured, organized, and disciplined. For Van Buren, politics was not about individuals with grand ideals. It was about managing coalitions, balancing interests, and keeping power within a reliable circle. The Regency handpicked candidates, coordinated legislation, and ensured that their influence reached from local towns to the halls of the U.S. Senate. In 1821, Van Buren was elected to the United States Senate. He brought his organizing skills with him to Washington, D.C., where he began quietly reshaping national Democratic-Republican politics. He opposed the expansion of federal power and supported states' rights, but more importantly, he saw the necessity of building a strong, unified political party. Van Buren was instrumental in creating the two-party system in America. He believed that a loyal opposition was not only healthy but essential for democratic governance. Without opposition, he warned, governments would become unaccountable and drift toward tyranny. At the same time, Van Buren aligned himself with a rising populist war hero, Andrew Jackson. Jackson had lost the controversial 1824 election, despite winning the popular vote, and Van Buren saw in Jackson the perfect figure to rally the common man and reshape American democracy. He began laying the groundwork for Jackson's comeback in 1828, organizing supporters, managing party platforms, and fanning anti-elite sentiment. Van Buren also served briefly as governor of New York in 1829, but he held the office for only a few months before resigning to join Jackson's administration. By then, his influence had grown well beyond New York. He was becoming known as the brains behind Jacksonian democracy, the man who understood how to turn ideals into power. Quietly, patiently, and with surgical precision, Martin Van Buren had moved from a small-town lawyer to the central strategist of a national political movement. His next stop, the White House. Secretary of State, the shadow strategist, 1829 to 1831. When Andrew Jackson became the 7th President of the United States in 1829, one of his first and most crucial appointments was Martin Van Buren as Secretary of State. This position marked Van Buren's entry into the executive branch, and although the title suggested diplomacy and foreign affairs, his true role was much larger. He became Jackson's most trusted political advisor. Van Buren managed U.S. relations with Britain, France, and Mexico, helping to settle long-standing commercial disputes and enhancing diplomatic cooperation. But his most influential work wasn't in foreign policy. It was in managing the cabinet and acting as Jackson's political compass. He helped navigate the turbulent early months of Jackson's presidency, especially during the Eaton Affair, also known as the Petticoat Affair. This social scandal involved the wives of cabinet members, most notably Peggy Eaton, whose morality was questioned by other political wives. The conflict spiraled into a bitter divide within Jackson's administration. Most of the cabinet members turned against Eaton, but Van Buren, a widower and free of entangling social ties, supported Jackson and Peggy. Recognizing the dysfunction, Van Buren offered to resign in 1831, allowing Jackson to reshuffle his cabinet and restore unity. This selfless gesture won him immense favor with Jackson. More than a loyal supporter, Van Buren had proved himself a tactician willing to sacrifice his position for the greater political cause. Jackson began referring to him affectionately as the Northern man with Southern principles, signaling Van Buren's support for states' rights and limited government, both cornerstones of Jacksonian ideology. His resignation was not a fall from power, but a calculated move. Jackson had bigger plans for him. Later that year, Jackson appointed Van Buren as minister to the United Kingdom, a prestigious diplomatic role. But in a dramatic political twist, the Senate, led by Vice President John C. Calhoun, rejected his nomination, resulting in a rare tie-breaking vote that killed the appointment. Ironically, this defeat only elevated Van Buren's popularity. Jackson viewed the rejection as a personal insult and vowed to support Van Buren in the next election. As Vice President of the United States, 1833 to 1837, Van Buren returned to the political stage stronger than ever. In the 1832 election, Jackson selected him as his running mate for his second term. Their ticket won a resounding victory over the National Republican opposition led by Henry Clay. As vice president, Van Buren worked quietly but effectively. While Jackson was the populist general, fiery and confrontational, Van Buren was the manager, a cool-headed strategist who ensured the administration's agenda moved forward without unnecessary chaos. This was a turbulent time in U.S. politics. The Jackson administration was waging war against the Second Bank of the United States, which Jackson viewed as a corrupt institution that favored the elite. Van Buren supported Jackson's controversial decision to remove federal deposits from the bank, a move that destabilized the financial system but resonated with Jacksonian values of decentralization. Another major conflict was the nullification crisis, where South Carolina, led by John C. Calhoun, declared the federal tariffs of 1828 and 1832 unconstitutional. Jackson threatened to use military force to enforce federal law, and Van Buren backed him. Though Van Buren personally supported states' rights, he did not support secession or rebellion, and like Jackson, believed in preserving the Union at all costs. Behind the scenes, Van Buren continued to build the Democratic Party into a well-oiled national machine. He understood better than anyone that politics wasn't just about speeches or ideals. It was about organization, loyalty, and voter mobilization. By the time Jackson's second term was ending, there was no doubt who his successor would be. Jackson publicly endorsed Martin Van Buren as his political heir, stating, "I know of no man more worthy to be my successor." In 1836, Van Buren stood as the Democratic candidate for president, fully backed by the Jacksonian coalition. But the election would not be easy. The election of 1836, a divided opposition, a clear victory. The 1836 election was unlike any before. The newly formed Whig Party, a coalition of national Republicans, anti-Masons, and former Jackson opponents, couldn't agree on a single candidate. Instead, they ran 4 regional candidates in a calculated effort to split the electoral vote and throw the decision to the House of Representatives. Their plan failed. Martin Van Buren, running with Richard Mentor Johnson as his vice presidential pick, won with 170 electoral votes, defeating his opponents by a comfortable margin. He became the 8th president of the United States and the first president who was born a U.S. citizen. All previous presidents had been born before the Revolution. Van Buren inherited a country on the brink of prosperity, or so it seemed. His inauguration on March 4, 1837, was a day of optimism, though he hinted at challenges ahead. In his inaugural address, Van Buren acknowledged the pressures of following Jackson, but he confidently stated, "I follow in the footsteps of illustrious men." But even before the ink on his inauguration papers had dried, the nation was already spiraling into a crisis that would define his entire presidency. The Panic of 1837. The Panic of 1837, a presidency in crisis. Just a few weeks into Van Buren's presidency, the American economy collapsed. What began as a banking panic quickly escalated into a full-blown economic depression, the most severe the young nation had ever faced. Several factors led to the Panic of 1837. Jackson's specie circular policy had required payment for government land to be in gold or silver, leading to a severe currency crunch. The dismantling of the Second Bank of the United States had destabilized financial institutions. Rampant land speculation, unregulated banking practices, and an international credit contraction all collided. British banks pulled back loans from the U.S., triggering panic among American investors. Banks collapsed. Businesses failed. Unemployment soared. Farmers and workers lost everything, and bread riots broke out in major cities. Van Buren, inheriting this chaos, found himself blamed for a disaster not entirely of his making. His approach to the crisis was guided by his strict political philosophy. He believed the federal government should not intervene directly in the economy. No bailouts, no national relief programs. He believed that doing so would set a dangerous precedent and violate the Constitution's limitations on federal power. This stance was politically disastrous. As Americans demanded action, Van Buren responded with restraint. He proposed the independent treasury system, which removed government funds from private banks and stored them in federal vaults. A bold reform, but one that did little to relieve the immediate suffering of citizens. Critics began calling him Martin Van Ruin. His polished appearance and formal manners made him seem aloof and detached. Where Jackson had been a man of action, Van Buren was a man of process. And during a time of economic pain, that distinction cost him dearly. By 1839, the Depression was still ongoing, and opposition forces were gathering strength. The Whigs, having learned from their 1836 defeat, were preparing to unite behind a single charismatic candidate. Van Buren's time in office was not yet over, but his grip on power was slipping. The election of 1840, Martin Van Ruin, and the rise of the Whigs. As the economy continued to suffer through 1839 to 1840, Van Buren prepared to seek a second term. But he faced a re-energized opposition, now united under the Whig Party. The Whigs nominated William Henry Harrison, a military hero from the Battle of Tippecanoe, and styled him as a man of the people, contrasting him sharply with the aristocratic image they painted of Van Buren. The Whigs ran one of the first truly modern, media-driven campaigns in American history. They used slogans, songs, rallies, and promotional merchandise, most famously the slogan, "Tippecanoe and Tyler too." Van Buren, meanwhile, refused to campaign in person, as was traditional at the time. His silence, however, hurt him. At a moment when the country was demanding answers, he appeared distant and detached. The Whigs called him Martin Van Ruin, blaming him for the Depression, unemployment, and widespread suffering. In November 1840, the results were devastating. Harrison won 234 electoral votes to Van Buren's 60. It was one of the worst defeats in presidential history up to that point. But irony had one last twist in store. William Henry Harrison died just 31 days into his presidency, and John Tyler assumed office. The Whigs, despite their landslide, would fracture, while Van Buren would begin plotting his return. Return from the shadows, the struggle for the 1844 nomination. Despite his 1840 defeat, Van Buren remained a central figure within the Democratic Party. He saw the presidency slipping toward factions he viewed as either radical or disloyal to true Jacksonian principles. And so, he set his eyes once again on the White House in 1844. Van Buren was initially the frontrunner for the Democratic nomination. However, a single issue would cost him the support he needed: Texas. Van Buren opposed the immediate annexation of Texas because it would provoke war with Mexico and further intensify the debate over slavery. His cautious, constitutional approach appealed to moderates but alienated Southern Democrats who wanted expansion, and who wanted it now. As the convention dragged on, Southern delegates shifted their support to a dark horse candidate, James K. Polk, an ardent expansionist and pro-Texas figure. Van Buren, lacking the necessary two-thirds majority, was pushed aside. It was a bitter defeat, not just politically but personally. Van Buren felt the Democratic Party had betrayed its founding principles by embracing aggressive expansionism and slavery politics. It would be the beginning of his final political transformation. The Free Soil Party and a Stand Against Slavery, 1848. By the late 1840s, Martin Van Buren, once Jackson's right-hand man, had become disillusioned with the Democratic Party's embrace of slavery expansion. When the issue of whether to allow slavery in newly acquired Western territories came to the forefront, Van Buren broke from his old party. In 1848, he became the presidential nominee for the Free Soil Party, a newly formed political movement dedicated to stopping the spread of slavery into Western lands. Their slogan was clear and firm: free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. Van Buren's candidacy was symbolic more than competitive. He had no realistic chance of winning, but his goal was not to win, it was to send a message that the expansion of slavery must be halted and that there was no compromise with injustice. His campaign split the Democratic vote, especially in New York, allowing the Whig candidate Zachary Taylor to win the presidency. Many Democrats accused Van Buren of handing the election to the Whigs, but Van Buren stood by his principles. Though he received no electoral votes, Van Buren won over 10% of the national popular vote, a significant showing for a third-party candidate. The Free Soil Party's message would later be absorbed into the newly formed Republican Party, and Van Buren's stand would echo into the Civil War era. Lindenwold, Retirement, Reflection, and the Civil War, 1850s, 1862. Following the 1848 campaign, Martin Van Buren retired permanently from public life. He returned to his estate, Lindenwold, in Kinderhook, where he lived a quiet life of reading, writing, and reflection. Now in his 70s, he remained in contact with political leaders and kept close watch on the events unfolding across the nation. The Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the rising sectional tensions worried him deeply. Though once a proponent of states' rights, Van Buren had evolved. He now believed that the issue of slavery was tearing the country apart. He watched in sorrow as his old party split, and the political system he had helped build became a battlefield of ideologies. When Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, Van Buren privately supported the Union cause, though he was too old and frail to take an active role. He feared secession and civil war, but he also believed slavery had to be curtailed. As the nation descended into the Civil War in 1861, Van Buren knew the America he helped build was being tested like never before. Death of a Political Giant, 1862. On July 24, 1862, at the age of 79, Martin Van Buren passed away peacefully in his home at Lindenwold. The Civil War raged across the country, and much of the public's attention was fixed on the bloody struggle between North and South. As a result, his death did not command the same national mourning as previous presidents. Yet for those who understood the roots of American democracy, Van Buren's passing marked the end of an era. He was buried in his hometown of Kinderhook, New York, at the Kinderhook Reformed Cemetery, near the church of his childhood. Though the world moved quickly beyond his death, historians and political scholars would later revisit his life and recognize his enormous impact on the American system. Legacy: the architect of the American party system. Martin Van Buren's legacy is not defined by military victories or landmark legislation. Instead, his legacy lies in the political architecture he helped build. He was the father of the Democratic Party as a modern institution, a man who saw the necessity of organized national political parties in a democratic republic. Before Van Buren, political factions were considered temporary and often suspect. He argued that parties were essential for representing public opinion, controlling power, and maintaining accountability. He transformed American politics by building state-level party organizations and linking them to national coalitions, promoting democratic participation and expanding the voter base, crafting the two-party system that still shapes the United States today. Though his presidency was troubled, marked by economic collapse and deep unpopularity, his intellectual and strategic contributions outlasted his time in office. He was a man of paradoxes, born in a tavern, but refined in his manners. Soft-spoken, yet politically ruthless, a states' rights advocate who ended his life fighting slavery. History has often overlooked Martin Van Buren, placing him in the shadows of louder, more dramatic presidents. But those who study the mechanics of American democracy recognize him as one of its most essential engineers. In the end, Martin Van Buren didn't just play the game of politics, he rewrote the rules.